Hello there and welcome along. Today's tutorial is going to take a very different format than I'm used to working with here in the garden, and it involves no fewer than 3 different tripods set up in actually 4 different locations in the garden. Today we're going to be talking about climbing and rambling roses, how to prune and, more importantly, how to train them. The first thing to bear in mind with this particular thing is there is no such thing as a climbing rose. All climbing roses are simply large shrubs that need support, and it's down to you to decide how you want to train them and how you want to prune them in the garden to get the effects that are actually right for you. So whether you fan train them onto a wall, whether you grow them upright and tear prune them on a post or pillar, whether you spiral them round an obelisk, or whether you actually bring the canes into the horizontal position on a large wall, for instance like a garage, or grow them round your front door, this tutorial hopefully should cover most things for you. The first things to bear in mind when you're choosing a climbing or rambling rose for your garden is to make sure that you have enough space. There's absolutely no point in choosing a climbing or rambling rose that's simply going to swamp the structure or building that you put it up and enter into this lifelong battle where you're constantly cutting the rose back and it's never ever reaching its full potential, and always putting lots and lots of excess growth as it tries to reach its full growing potential. Sometimes with these things you're often best wanting ever so slightly more and planting, for instance, a large informal shrub if you're limited on space, and be wanting ever so slightly more from the rose than actually swamping the structure. The other thing to bear in mind is how you actually plant the rose. Climbing and rambling roses must be planted at the correct distance away from the structure you're planning to grow it up. If you're planning to grow up an obelisk, plant on the outside of the obelisk and spiral the canes around the outside. If you're growing up a freestanding post, for instance, it's not so important as if you were growing against a wall or a garage. You must make sure you're planting at least 24 to 36 inches away from the foundations of the building, allowing your rose plenty of distance between the footings and the actual plant itself, a nice trap of soil that means the roots aren't going to be scorched. Concrete, render and stone draw up a huge amount of water from the soil and can actually scorch the roots inside. So you must make sure that you're planting at the correct distance to allow the plant plenty of space away from the wall and to get enough moisture. The other thing to bear in mind is also you must make sure that you're mulching the entire root zone along the wall. These are substantial plants and take a long time to get actually established. So when you're mulching, don't just put a bucket or a wheelbarrow full of mulch around the base of the plant. Spread it out across the entire root zone of where the plant may have actually taken its roots to. Establishing a climbing or rambling rose in your garden is going to take some time, and it's not like growing a shrub. These are substantial plants which take years and years to establish. So your first 1, 2 and 3 years should be really focused on getting the plant established, settled and growing away healthily. And only realistically after its first 36 months in the ground is it going to start producing really nice and easy canes that are going to be easy for you to train and actually get to the point where you want to actually bring them into the positions and get the desired effect. We're going to have a wander around the garden now and look at some different techniques, so bear with me a second. This is going to be a little untidy for this particular time in, but we're actually going to move around the garden, and the first thing I'm going to show you is a rose that has been trained onto a fence. This is a technique called fan training, and particularly useful if you're growing a large shrub. This one is actually Claire Austin and has been in the ground for around 8 or 9 years. I've been growing it as a shrub, and over a period of time it's got a little unruly. So what I've done this season is I fan trained it back onto the fence. So you can see here, if I just pop the camera down, you can see here Claire Austin behind me, and all I've done is remove several of the lower canes from right down low for the plant, stimulating strong basal growth. That means the plant is going to throw up some really nice strong canes over the next season or 2 from the ground. So I've removed the older and less productive stems. I've then simply trained the canes out into as close to horizontal positions as possible, bringing them down into 45 and 90 degree angles to slow the sap down. What this does is it means that when the sap is full of hormones at the period of time when the plant is growing, or when the plant is actually going to be producing flowers, it slows the hormones down and culminates them at the points where there are the buds or where you've made cuts and incisions. I've simply tidied all the growth back then, taken off the very tips and taken any side or lateral shoots back to around 2 or 3 buds from where the growth came. With pruning a climbing or rambling rose that's pruned in this particular way, it's not so important to actually select an outward facing bud as if you were when you were growing a shrub or a standard or tree rose. This is really easy to do. Don't forget to set up your vine eyes and your straining wires. There's a tutorial of how to do that here on my site now. And then simply tie the canes in using Hessian twine, which over a period of around 12 to 18 months will slowly biodegrade, getting you to around this time next year when it's time to take the rose off this structure and retrain it again. The next particular one we're going to look at is training a climbing or rambling rose onto a freestanding obelisk. This can either be an obelisk that you've purchased yourself or one like me that you've actually built. I tend to build mine out of hazel. Freestanding, I sink the hazel canes into the ground around the plant, and this particular technique is really useful for large shrub roses such as Mill on the Floss, which is just behind me. This particular one has been in the ground for a little over 4 years now, and you can see all I've simply done is plant the shrub rose on the outside of the obelisk, built a very basic wigwam. This could be a wrought iron purchased obelisk if you want it to be, and then all I've done is spiral the canes around the outside, again bringing them as close to the horizontal position as at all possible and shortened back the lateral growth. I've left mine a little longer on this one because this particular rose is quite floppy and I love the arching technique of this one. However, if you wanted to, you can shorten these lateral growths back to between 1 and 2 bud points from where the actual rose originated the growth from. Once again, by bringing the canes down into a close to as horizontal position as possible, we slow the sap down and slow the hormones in the plant down, allowing the plant to produce much more sexual and much more flowering growth in a very much smaller space. This particular rose once again is tied on with Hessian twine, which over a period of the next 15 to 18 months will slowly biodegrade. This time next year I'll have to dismantle the obelisk completely. Really easy to do. I simply undo all the Hessian twine, load the rose on the floor, rebuild the obelisk using hazel sticks, and then simply do my pruning while the rose is laid out on the floor before spiraling it back round the actual obelisk itself. Really easy to do and very cost effective as well. The next particular tutorial that we're going to have a look at, or the next technique we're going to have a look at, is actually returning to the location we started this particular video at. This is how to actually tie or prune a rose onto a pillar, post or upright. So if you have an obelisk, for instance, which you would like to grow a rose up, this particular rose behind me is actually Bring Me Sunshine, and you can see here planted in its pots, what I do is I tier prune it. Imagine this particular rose was actually attached to this upright and this was a pergola, for instance, or a post in the garden. All I've done is allow some canes to grow up to around 6 feet. I've taken the very tips out of those, and then I've layered my cuts all the way through the actual rose itself, starting around 12 inches from the ground. This rose is actually in a pot, but starting at around 12 inches from the ground, I've then layered my cuts, choosing an outward facing bud wherever possible. It's not again so crucial with this particular rose because it's obviously got lots of ventilation as it grows up and down the post. But staggering my cuts at around 6 to 8 inches, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now 6 layers of cuts in this particular plant, meaning everywhere I've made incisions, everywhere I've made a layered cut, I'm going to get an awful lot of growth. So I'm going to get this tiered sort of a crescending type effect with the blooms. It's going to flower all the way through the plant. Really good technique if you're, for instance, growing against a vertical space against a wall next to your front door, for instance, or between your front windows, where you want lots and lots of flowers from the ground all the way to the very top. The thing to bear in mind when you're training a rose is it's not a race to the top of the structure. Roses grow and flower on their very tips. So if you allow your rose to go straight to the top of your structure before bringing it down to the horizontal position, you're going to end up with loads and loads of growth at the top and loads of flowers at the top, but nothing at the bottom. So if you're growing, for instance, up the side of a rose arch or an arbor, this is a really good way of doing it. cut some stems nice and low. Here another about a foot above that, and again a foot above that, and a foot above that, and slowly work your way up the structure, allowing the canes to get longer and longer, for instance before you reach the top of the arbor. Otherwise you'll end up with loads of growth at the top and completely bald sides, which you could probably end up putting a clematis on the top. But the problem is when the rose is all up the top, it becomes difficult to maintain, and often in the wind will bring your structure down. So we call this tier pruning, and it's particularly useful, I say, growing up the side of a rose arch, up a pillar or a post. Right, the next one is actually a traditional climbing rose, where you may be mounting the rose to a side of a building. Oh, I should have actually picked up the tripod at that particular point. Bear with me a second. Let's just put you back on the tripod. I'm going to pick it up because we're going to now go over to my Gertrude Jekyll, which is trained on the side of this small outbuilding. This is done in a much more traditional way than most of you would think about when you're thinking about a climbing or rambling rose. And you can see here, Gertrude Jekyll, now a part of it is fan trained, which is the bit just to my left. Let's turn that round so you can see it. Very traditionally fan trained there. What I'm going to be doing now is shortening back these growths to around 1 or 2 buds from where the actual growth originated. And again, here I shall start bringing these stems right down. However, off to my right, we have an area of the plant which is actually trained in the horizontal position. And now what we're going to do, once these canes are in the horizontal position, slowing down that sap, we're going to simply prune them back. So this is the same technique across all groups. You want to shorten the lateral growth, the side growth, back to around between 1, 2, 3 and 4 buds from where it came. Simply take your secateurs, an angled cut, find your bud point and remove all of the growth. You're then producing lots and lots of short and dumpy growth, where you're going to get lots and lots of flowers produced at these particular points. This particular tutorial has been a little untidy, but but there's no other way of doing it to cover as many subjects as you want. Please pick from this particular tutorial all the bits and pieces. There is an individual tutorial for each technique. So whether you're growing up an obelisk, whether you're fan training, whether you're training on a wall like the rose behind me, or whether you're growing in an upright space, for instance on a pillar, post or the side of a rose arch, there is an individual video for each one of these particular points. Please remember, your climbing and rambling rose is not going to be glorious overnight. This is a long-term investment. It's going to take 2 or 3 years, maybe even 4 years, for the plant to get itself established, settled, and start producing lots of growth that you can actually train. Sometimes in the first couple of years, all you need to do is give it a good amount of mulch and take any remaining sexual growth off that may have been carried through from last year. So any seed heads or hips that may still be born. Just give the plant some time, give it plenty of water, and especially if you're growing against a wall or a building, make sure that you're applying lots and lots of water to the plant during the summer months to make sure it's not cooking dry during the summer. The other thing to bear in mind is get your supports sorted out earlier rather than later. Trellis, it always seems like a really good idea when you put the rose up, but unfortunately trellises are really not particularly great for roses. They don't allow for a huge amount of airflow or ventilation between the plant and the structure that you're actually attaching it to, and often when you need it the most, it has rotted and it will actually fall down, bringing the rose with it. So I would suggest getting yourself set up with some simple vine eyes and some straining wires. Get those done just as soon as possible, and never put a rose in the ground that you haven't got your vine eyes and wires sorted out for, to make sure everything is in place. Space them around 12 to 15 inches apart. I normally find it's better to anchor these into the masonry rather than the brickwork. It's much easier to get your fixings in there, and make sure that you use really good raw plugs as well. That just about concludes today's ramblings for today on climbing and rambling roses, but please make sure that you ask any questions that you have, find those particular videos and take part from the bits for this particular tutorial or this particular rambling of the bits that you actually wanted to take with you. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you all again very soon. Take good care now. Bye-bye.